For 7 years, every single Sunday after church, my husband disappeared for exactly 40 minutes. Never explained, never discussed. He would help unhitch the horse, walk me partway toward whichever kitchen needed extra hands that week, and then quietly turn and walk in the opposite direction, toward the tree line at the edge of whatever farm we were visiting. I remember the specific sound of his boots on the gravel fading as he walked away. Always the same unhurried pace, always disappearing into the same kind of quiet I had learned over the years, not to question. I would watch him go, just for a moment, before turning back toward the noise and warmth of whatever kitchen was waiting for me. I assumed for 7 years that I simply did not need to know. And then, on an ordinary Sunday in our 8th year of marriage, I finally followed him. My name is Elizabeth. And what I found at the end of that walk changed how I understood my husband more completely than anything he had told me in 7 years of marriage combined. Let me explain what an ordinary Sunday looked like for us, so you understand how easily this pattern hid itself in plain sight. Church rotated between farmhouses across our district, the service running 3 or 4 hours, followed by the communal meal that every family shared afterward. In the chaos of that meal, women moving through kitchens, children running between rooms, men gathered in loose conversation across the yard, a man quietly stepping away for 40 minutes was not the kind of thing anyone would necessarily notice. Certainly not the kind of thing anyone would question. I noticed, eventually, only because the pattern was so consistent. Rain or shine, warm season or cold, my husband Daniel disappeared toward the tree line, every single week, for exactly the same span of time. I asked him about it once, early in our marriage, and he told me simply that he needed a few minutes alone after the long service, a small quiet before the busyness of the afternoon meal. I accepted that answer. It seemed reasonable enough. Men in our community were not always eager to explain themselves, and a husband wanting some quiet time did not strike me as anything worth pressing further. But 7 years is a long time to accept an answer without ever fully examining it. And I want to ask you something right now. Has there ever been something in your own life, a habit in someone you love, a pattern so consistent you stopped even registering it as strange, that you simply filed away as normal without ever actually understanding it? That is exactly what those 40 minutes had become for me. Not a mystery, just weather, just the shape of an ordinary Sunday. The Sunday I finally followed him arrived without any particular plan on my part. We were at his cousin's farm that week, and as he turned, as always, toward the tree line at the edge of the property, something in me simply decided, almost without deciding, to walk quietly a short distance behind him. He did not go far. Just past the tree line, into a small clearing I had never had reason to notice, was an old, weathered grave marker, simple and plain, the kind our community used, half swallowed by grass that had clearly not been recently tended. Daniel knelt beside it. He did not speak, not that I could hear. He simply knelt there, quiet, his hat in his hands, for several long minutes. I stood behind the tree line for what felt like a very long time, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe too loudly. The afternoon light came down soft and gold through the leaves above him, and I remember thinking, watching his shoulders bowed in that particular stillness, that I was seeing a version of my husband I had somehow lived beside for 7 years, without ever once glimpsing. I stood behind the tree line, my own heart beating hard, understanding suddenly that I had stumbled into something private that had nothing at all to do with me, and everything to do with a grief I had never known he was still carrying. I learned later that evening, gently asking him about it, rather than admitting I had followed him, that the grave belonged to his younger brother, a boy who had died at 11 years old, several years before Daniel and I had ever met, from an illness that had moved through their district that particular winter. Daniel had been 13 at the time, old enough to remember everything, too young to have any real way of processing what he had lost. He told me that evening, in a voice quieter than I had ever heard him use, about carrying his brother's small coffin alongside his father, about the particular silence that had settled over their household in the months afterward, about how quickly everyone around him had seemed to expect him to simply continue on, as though the world had not fundamentally changed. Nobody had asked 13-year-old Daniel how he was managing his own grief. He had simply been expected to keep working, keep attending church, keep being useful. And so he had found on his own, without anyone teaching him, this quiet, private way of continuing to show up for his brother that no one else needed to know about. He told me that every Sunday, wherever church happened to be held that week, If the location was anywhere near enough to reach his brother's grave, he made the walk. Not out of obligation, out of something closer to loyalty, a private, wordless promise he had made to himself as a grieving 13-year-old boy to make sure his brother was never left alone for too long, even in death. I want you to sit with that for a moment because I think it says something important about the people we love and about how much of their inner life can remain genuinely invisible to us, even after years of shared marriage, shared meals, shared ordinary Sundays. I had built a small, harmless story in my mind about those 40 minutes. A husband simply wanting quiet. Nothing more complicated than that. The real story had been sitting there the entire time, 7 years of it, and I had never once thought to ask more carefully. I did not tell Daniel that evening that I had followed him. I have never told him, actually, until choosing to share this story now. What I did instead was quietly, gently, begin joining him on those Sunday walks, not every week, but often enough that eventually it simply became something we did together, rather than something he carried alone. I never asked to go. I simply began walking beside him one Sunday, without announcement. The same wordless way he had always made the walk himself, and he never once told me not to. We have tended that grave together for over a decade now. The grass stays cut. Fresh flowers appear in warmer months. And I understand now that those 40 minutes were never really about needing quiet time after a long church service. They were about loyalty. About a promise a grieving child made to himself that a grown man never once considered breaking, even privately, even when no one but the two of us would ever know it was being kept. Sometimes, standing beside Daniel at that small clearing on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, I think about how easily this could have remained hidden forever. How close I came, across 7 whole years, to never fully knowing this quiet, faithful part of the man I had married. I think about how many other small private loyalties must be carried silently inside the people we love every single day, invisible simply because we never happen to follow them far enough to see. I want to ask you something before I go tonight. Is there something in someone you love, a habit, a silence, a pattern you have simply accepted without asking deeper questions about it, that might actually be carrying a whole private world you have never fully seen? I am not suggesting you should follow anyone through a tree line the way I once did. I am suggesting only that sometimes the smallest, most consistent habits in the people closest to us are the ones most worth gently, carefully asking about. I am grateful all these years later that I finally did.